Okay, hello everybody. So today we are going to continue our discussion in Chapter 8, Section 6. And if you recall or you had a chance to watch the first video, I introduced to you how we go about factoring things we call quadratic trinomials. Now, in the first video, all of the quadratic trinomials that we factored had positive um, coefficients. Every single one of them was all positive. So if you see right here in this first one, this number was positive, positive, positive. And the next one, it was all positives across here. In these ones, it was all positive, and these were all positive. So the reason why we start with just positive numbers is they are much easier to understand what you're doing when you don't have to worry about what the signs are going to be. But today I'm going to expand into some problems where the coefficients aren't all positive. There are other ones that you'll have to kind of consider when looking at the various problems. So we're going to start with writing down, it's called a sign shortcut. So this was going to show you what your factors will end up being based on the signs that you have in the quadratic trinomial that you are trying to factor. So you can see I highlighted those signs. So those signs will dictate to us what signs we end up having over here and here. So at first, whenever you have all positives, so when this number is positive and this number is positive, you will have both positive numbers in your factors. So that's pretty easy. If there's two pluses in the original equation or expression, then your factors will both be positive. Now, the where it gets a little bit tricky is when you start mixing in some negatives. So for instance, if you see right here, this first one that is going to be negative, that when this middle term here is negative and this last term is positive, that will result in both of the factors being negative. Now, the next one, and I'll explain further why that is when we actually look at a number example. The next one we want to take a look at is if the first or the middle term is positive and the second term is negative. When that happens, one of the factors will be positive and one of the factors will be negative. So and that'll just depend on which number it turns out to be, which you'll again see that once we do a numeric example. Now, the last example here is when this is negative, this center term, and the last one is also negative. And there again, it's kind of the same as the last one. If both of those numbers are negative, that means one of the factors will be positive and one of the factors will be negative. Now, I don't really expect you to memorize that. This is really here just as a shortcut or a helpful hint. As we go through the next set of problems, we can always refer back to it. And so that's what we'll do here as we look at this first one. You can see my expression. We have m to the second plus 6m minus 16. So we have the case where we have a positive and a negative. And so if we look at our factors, if I write our factors down, let's put a set of parentheses like this. The first one is positive, the second one is negative. If we look at that, that is this one right here. So you can see we have a positive, then a negative. That means that our factors, one of them will be positive and one of them will be negative. So if we want, we can go in and write that in here, and we can put a plus right here and a minus right there. So we know one of our factors will be positive, one will be negative. And now we're going to proceed to factor it just like we did in the previous video. We want two numbers that add to give us positive 6, and we want two numbers that multiply to give us negative 16. Now this is where it gets a little bit tricky. We need to write down the factors of 16. So it's 1 and 16, 2 and 8, or 4 and 4. So there are our three pairs of factors. Now remember, in order for them to multiply to be negative 16, one of the numbers of the pairs would have to be negative. So it's either going to be negative 1 and positive 16 or positive 1 and negative 16. And that goes on for this as well. It can be -2 and +8, or it can be +2 and -8. So we don't quite know yet which one is which. And one of the fours would also have to be negative. Now, what dictates which number is negative is going to be we need them to add up to be +6. They need to be +6. So looking over these pairs of numbers, knowing that they have to multiply to be negative, one number has to be negative. If I look at this 2 right here, if I make this a -2 and a +8, when I multiply those together, it gives me -16. And when I add -2 and +8, I get +6. So those are going to be the two numbers we will use. So as you can see, we have an m squared. So we'll put an m here and here. And then we will use the 8 for the positive side and then the 2 for the negative side. And then you're done. So you can see that it adds a bit more complexity to picking out the factors that you need whenever one of them has to be negative and one has to be positive, because it adds a lot of different possibilities that you kind of have to go through. So let's try another one. So once again, we have a positive and then a negative. So I've got a +8 and then a -9. So when I have a positive and a negative, the factors will turn out to be also one of them will be positive and one of them will be negative. You can also see that we have an a squared there, which means it'll be a times a. So we can get that out of the way. Now what we need to do is determine what the two numbers are that we put there. Now the way that we determine that number is the same way as we did it before. We need them to add to be +8, and then we need them to multiply to be -9. Now, we need to go through and write the factors of 9. The factors of 9 are 1 and 9, or 3 and 3. Now remember, we need them to multiply to be -9. So in order to multiply to be a negative number, one number has to be negative. So we have to figure out, should the 1 be negative or should the 9 be negative? Or maybe that wasn't even the correct pair. Maybe one of the 3's has to be negative. They need to multiply to be -9. But they also have to add to be +8. So one of them has to be negative, and they have to add to be +8. So if you look at these two right here, if I make it -1 and +9, -1 times 9 is -9, so that gives us the correct number for multiplication. And then -1 plus 9 gives me 8, which also gives me the correct number that we needed for the addition. So we know that the two numbers we need are -1 and 9. So we can write the +9 right here, and then the -1 right there, and we're done. We factored it. So now we're going to move into some problems that are just really a continuation of the last couple that we did. You can see that we have a positive and then a negative. So we have a +4 and a -21. So when it's a positive and a negative, we can write our parentheses. First one will be positive. Second one can be negative. Now the variable here is r. So we'll write an r right here and an r right there. Now once again, we need two numbers that will add to be +4, and they need to multiply to be -21. So we'll write out our factors of 21, 1 and 21, and then 3 and 7. So those are our only two sets of factors. Remember, they have to multiply to be negative. So in order to multiply to be a negative number, one of these pairs has to be a negative number. So it's either a -1 and a +21, or it's a +1 and a -21. Those both would multiply to give us -21. But in this case, we're going to go with the 3 and the 7. Because if you look at the 3 and the 7, if I make the 3 a negative number, you can see that -3 times 7 is -21, which is what we need. But -3 plus 7 is +4. And that's also what we need. So we needed them to multiply to be a negative number, and we needed them to add to be +4. So there's our two numbers. So we'll write the 7 right here, and then we will write the 3 right there, and we're done. Also recall, as I showed you in the first video, if you wanted to double check that you did your problem correctly, you could FOIL these back together like this. And once you did that, combine your like terms, and you will see that you will get the original equation that we started with, or not equation, excuse me, expression. We would get r squared plus 4r minus 21. So here's another one to try. It's just like the last ones. You can see that we have a positive and then a negative. So when I write out my parentheses, it will be also a positive and a negative. The variable we're starting with is an n, and we need to come up with two numbers that add to be +6 and multiply to be -27. Now, in order to do that, we will write out our factors of 27, 1 and 27, and then 3 and 9. And that's it. Those are all the factors of 27. So which of those two pairs, when we multiply them together, will give us -27, but will also add to give us +6? So if you look at these right here, if I make the 3 a -3, you can see that it will add to be +6, and they will also multiply to be -27. So we'll have a +9 right there, and then a -3 right there. And there's our final answer in factored form. So what happens if the signs are not a positive and then a negative like those four? There are other variations, as you could see up here, right? So we can have a positive and a positive, which is what we did yesterday. We could have a positive and then a negative, which is what we just got done doing 4 examples of. But there's 2 other ones here. So let's see what the next example is. So the next example you can see gives us a negative and a negative. All right, this one also has a negative and a negative. And then the last 2 that I'm going to show you will have a negative and a negative and a negative and a negative. So let's go back and take a look at what the little shortcut for signs tells us. When we have 2 negatives, you will end up with one that is positive and one that is negative. So it's just like the ones that we just got done doing. So if there's a double negative, you will end up with a plus and a minus. So let's take a look at that. So the procedure is still the same here. We have this expression. We want to find 2 numbers that add to be -4, and they multiply to be -12. Remember what we said. The shortcut told us that when we do this, if you have 2 negatives, you will end up with 1 plus and 1 minus. So let's see if that holds true. So we want to write our factors of 12 out. 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4. So there are all of our factors of 12. And now we need to figure out how would they multiply together to be -12, but then add to be -4. So remember, in order to multiply to be a negative number, one or the other has to be negative. So either the 1 is negative or the negative is on the 12. Or you could have the 2 negative and the 6 be positive, or you could have the 2 be positive and the 6 be negative. So one of the 2 pairs has to be negative, and we need them to add to be -4. So the one that you want to look at is this one right here. If I take these up and I make it a -6, you can see that 2 minus 6 is indeed -4, and 2 times -6 is -12. So these are kind of like a puzzle, right? So you list your factors, then you have to figure out which one is going to be negative so it meets the requirements from the original expression. So now that we have our 2 numbers, you can see it's a +2 and a -6. The variable is a p, so we write a p first in both of those, and then we write plus 2 minus 6, just like that. And there's our final answer for that one. Number 10 is going to be done the same way. We need them to add to be negative 4, and we need them to multiply to be negative 21. So we will write out our factors of 21. We either have 1 and 21 or 3 and 7. We need those to add up to be a negative 4. They need to multiply to be a negative. In order to multiply to be a negative, one or the other has to be a negative. And you can see from the pairs, we need them to add to be negative 4, which means we'll have a positive 3 and a negative 7. So 3 times negative 7 is negative 21, and 3 minus 7 is negative 4. So once we found our two numbers, we can go ahead and write our parentheses. As we said before, when you have a double negative in the original problem, you'll end up with a plus and a minus. The variable is an m, and then we write our numbers, 3 and then 7. And there you go. So we have that in factored form. So we're going to complete 2 more of these. These are the same as the last ones we did. You can see we have 2 negatives. So when we have 2 negatives, we know that the outcome, one will be positive, one will be negative. And from there, we can write our factors of 8. 1 and 8, 2 and 4. Now, because both are negative, one of the numbers here, one of these pairs, are going to have to be negative. Remember, we need them to add to be negative 7, and we need them to multiply to be negative 8. So that's going to occur with these two. If we have a positive 1 and a negative 8, that will give us negative 7 when you add those together, and also give us negative 8 when you multiply. So we'll write a y here and a y here, and then a plus 1 and a minus 8. And we're done. Last one, we have a double negative, once again. So one will be a plus, one will be a minus. Two numbers need to add to be negative 1, and they need to multiply to be negative 6. So we have 1 and 6, or 2 and 3. Now, multiplying to be negative 6 means one has to be negative and one has to be positive, but they also have to add to be negative 1. So the way that they're going to add to be negative 1 is if we make it a positive 2 and then a negative 3. So 2 minus 3 is negative 1, and 2 times negative 3 is negative 6. So once we do that, we have h, and we have plus 2 minus 3, and we're done. That's what we have. So there you go, guys. That's how you factor the next kind of quadratic trinomials that have different signs. In the next video, I will discuss what to do whenever you have a negative and then a positive. But until then, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Have a great day.